Hey everybody, I'm here at the Botanical Gardens. This is the tree that I call Light Changer. I have names for some trees, but not all of them. Because as the sun is setting, this tree it glows in all kinds of different ways, and you can see how it's got this really amazing golden tint at its edges. Yeah? Now, under ordinary circumstances, those birds would not generally let humans get that close to them. And this is a time in the gardens when animals take advantage of the lack of humans, which has been pretty extreme for the past couple of months during the pandemic. As sometimes happens, I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to talk about today, but in my last video I spoke a lot about how America is a delusional, Disneyland prison complex. And I think there's some truth to what I said there, although I don't want to make it explicit. I don't want to say, for example, that's the only thing America is, because that would just be lying. There are lots of amazing experiments that first happened here that didn't happen elsewhere. Lots of experiments in, and it's not like they succeeded perfectly, but I'm pretty sure that our country was the first country, and I'll happily stand corrected if I've got this wrong. I'm pretty sure our country was the first country to grant women the vote, which was a very important step in recognizing women as, completely human, rights endowed, full beings. Now it's ironic that any other situation could have ever obtained, because men begin as organs of women. So if there's something fundamentally wrong with women, it's pretty hard to see how the men are somehow raised above that, or elevated. It's very confusing. Though I can frame models where, in a very naive and bizarre way, we can imagine that. Someone on the news feed the other day was mentioning, as most of you know, I'm a huge fan of Hymenoptera, and I pause so that you get the sense of the word. The word hymen directly refers to the physical part of a woman that we also call her maidenhead, that which is penetrated and broken or torn the first time that she, usually the first time that she has intercourse, which we must hope is a consensual moment, though in vast numbers of cases it is not. So yeah, Hymenoptera are the bees and ants and wasps, and I'm endlessly fascinated by them, and I have a very rich and deep historical relationship with these amazing, complex, intelligent organisms. And the other day, here in the garden, I actually stepped on top of a yellow jacket nest because I was too busy making a video and playing with, what we call owl pellets or raptor pellets, to pay attention to where I was putting my feet. And that's the kind of incredible ignorance. I mean, I'm going to just straight up say that I was being stupid. I was doing something I've seen other people do, and we know other people have died of, right? They're so busy with their smartphone that it got them killed. Yeah? And that event could easily have resulted in me being severely injured or killed, even though death is not a common repercussion of being swarmed by yellow jackets. I've been having a conversation about human sexuality and various aspects of how the topic is introduced to us as children or in childhood, and sharing stories which are personal about this. And of course it's springtime. It's part of why the yellow jackets are making their nest. It's part of why the grass is dead and I could see the owl pellets and everything's flowering. We've just passed the flower moon in Blackfoot phenological cycles, although to call it phenological cycles is kind of a weird thing. Sorry about that. Because for, tens of thousands of years, the idea of using the word phenology, a bizarre, Latinate, pheno, right? Form, shape, ology, typology, would be ridiculous. But we are now, as of last night, in the, I can't remember the exact Blackfoot word. No, I can't remember. But we're in the long rains moon. A time where in their territory, particularly in Canada, the rains come and a wide range of phenomenon occur. And by the way, I want to encourage any of my listeners who are interested in phenology, which is the embodied relation with a living place that also engages us to study, but to study by relation, not by abstraction. The transformations in relationships and emergence and disappearance of the animals and insects and plants and their relationships over each moon cycle. And my dear friend Ryan Firstdiver, it's one word, you can find him on YouTube. If you have any interest in phenology, I recommend that you follow him and watch his videos. He has a video on each of the moon cycles, and these are pricelessly important, because we who have calendars instead of relationships have forgotten so much of what is important to our humanity. And by having the opportunity to learn with someone who has remembered, brought back to membership, right, some of these really crucial aspects of our way of being human in the world and how we relate with living places, it's an incredible moment of healing for those of us who are thus inclined. Not everyone is. Fair enough. We each have unique bodies, minds, histories, hopes, desires, fears, futures, dreams, nightmares, victories, tragedies. And this is often forgotten. And one of the topics that came up in the discussion I previously had, which might be a useful starting off place, we'll see how this goes, is, sorry, I keep getting haptic notifications on my watch, which is very disturbing when I'm trying to make a video. Perhaps I need to turn that off. I do keep location services off in general, but these devices are very complicated. we can't be sure that because we've turned something off that it's actually off, right? In any case, we were talking about me and my interlocutor, who I was having a conversation with a little while ago. We were talking about norm policing. People telling others what's normal, what's natural for human beings. And since the conversation was orbiting sexuality, we were talking about instances where people online are trying to tell other people how frequently, for example, they should be having sex. And I find this behavior crude, clumsy, and largely reprehensible. And the reason that this is so is that norms represent, although they might represent something that could be equated with the most common denominator, in other words, the average over some population or some segment or cultural population, that has nothing to do with what is good or natural or true or healthy. And the reason that it has nothing to do, well, maybe nothing to do is a little too severe. What I'm trying to say actually is that I'm very cautious. Okay, here we're going to get into some linguistic trouble. I want to say that I'm very cautious about generalizations. If I'm paying very close attention, and if you are too, you will notice that me being very cautious about generalizations, and here's where language becomes really tricky, that's a generalization. See the problem there? Now, I'm not saying I want us to get rid of generalizations. What I'm instead suggesting is that it's very important, if we want to use language intelligently and in a way that doesn't, mostly like our relationship with machines, doesn't make us dumber every time we make a move, doesn't reduce the breadth and scope of our awareness each time we enact it. Oh, I just saw a vole trying to cross the path up ahead of me. It's one of the reasons why raptors like to hunt in this time, is because the nocturnal rodents come out. So when I say, you can see, when I say like I'm very cautious and skeptical about some of the ways we use generalizations. Obviously generalizations are useful. And earlier I said in the conversation, I was like, these look to me to be the consequence of our relationship with language. But then I realized, no, they can be the consequence of embodied experience as well, right? We know, for example, that the spaghetti shouldn't just be mush, you know? And that we know if the apple doesn't taste like an apple. Norms and normative expectations are one of the things we use as shorthand to keep us from having to overthink or over-attend everything with our senses. And so norms and generalizations can be a useful aspect of our human cognitive behavior. I'm coming near the place where I made my really bad mistake the other day with the yellow jackets, and I'm always a little nervous when I get in this part of the gardens now. I'm going to film that spot this time, hopefully. Although, again, I'm pretty nervous about it. And the owl pellet that I left there is still there, and I kind of want it. But anyway, there are a variety of significant errors that we make. So that's where the yellow jacket nest is. And although you can't see it, the owl pellet with the skull is right next to that. In any case, there's a variety of sort of easy mistakes we make using our relatively intuitive habits of generalizing, so that, for example, if I see So I invented a retological fallacy, I think. It's possible that it already existed. In fact, it seems likely that it already did, but because I'm not aware of it, and by the way, if any of you, can trace this down for me, I'll appreciate it. I invented a fallacy that I call the Congregantes Passimi fallacy. And that means like group pessimism. And the way we use this fallacy in common thought language, and particularly in the news, is to ascribe some usually undesirable behavior that we have observed from some person who we can imagine to be an exponent of a given population segment or group, a derivable distinction. We observe some often malignant or negligent or ignorant behavior, and then we just generalize that from the individual instance to all members of a population. It's hard to give an example that isn't going to get me in trouble. But let's say that I see a dog grab some kid's Hot Wheel car and bury it. And then I decide dogs are thieves. Right? Now, I'm using an animal on purpose because if I use any human example, I can easily get in trouble, and I don't have time. I'm sort of improvising. I don't have time to carefully select, so I'm using a non-human example to illustrate my point. But many of us who, us language using humans, us news reading and news exposed and culture exposed humans, we are trained to think that, for example, males are dominant, right? It's not entirely untrue, it's just insufficiently true. And when we extend this categorical observation, if we believe it too much or we extend it too far, it blinds us. And most of the time that's what we do with generalizations. Generalizations, and again, I'm generalizing here when I say, or I'm generalizing about generalizations and I'm concerned about. Notice how complex and confusing this is. Many of us might be able to notice the first order problem, which is that generalizations can be deceptive. Not so many of us, but a few of us, particularly those who are linguistically and philosophically trained, and some people who just have a really good intuition or are bright, not many of us would notice the second order problem, which is that itself is a generalization, right? So if I say, for example, I don't like absolutes, same problem. Now, I tend to be cautious enough to leave some incompleteness in my assertion. So instead of saying generalizations are bad, which is a generalization, I'll say I'm skeptical, right? I'm suspicious of generalizations. But with absolutes, I'm more suspicious, right? It's very uncommon in our relationships with abstraction, with ideas, with knowledge, with theories, with concepts, with categories, right? That absolutes are justified. There are very simple cases where they can be. So, for example, if somebody accidentally steps on my foot, right? And I say, it is true that you just stepped on my foot. That's pretty absolutely true, right? It's not, or if I say, for example, you who are listening to me are not now standing beside me. That's pretty absolutely true, It's not perfectly absolutely true, but it's true enough for me to go like, okay, let's do the absolute thing and say, that's true, right? But with complex things and with abstract things, with knowledge, with language, we have to be really careful because it's easy to deceive ourselves. The tools turn us into their likeness if we're not aware of this. So this policing of normative behavior, which is something a number of very intelligent people, not all of whom are perfect, right? I'm not particularly... I enjoy listening, for example, to Jordan Peterson. It doesn't mean I believe everything that he says or that I think he's, you know, the best thing to happen to some segment of the intellectual population since some other thing that happened to some other segment. Right? He's not like the best thing since sliced bread. But there's aspects of his presentation and his mind that are edifying, right? They're enriching. I feel nourished. And there's other things he says where I'm just like, how did you come up with that, guy? I can't buy that, you know? So we don't have to, and this is another problem, right? We think that either people are either good or they're bad. No, actually, it's much more sophisticated than that. And your experience of people will depend to a great deal on the purposes that underlie your encountering them, right? And if you start out with the idea that you're going to judge them, well, you're going to get what you went looking for. Right? And it's the same thing with normative generalizations. And by normative, I mean generalizations that assert that one or some other thing is normal. And it's not that such things are... Again, the purpose matters a lot. And if the purpose is to police our fellow humans and try to rigidly normify them, like the kind of torture that happens to most of us in elementary school and high school, when what should be happening is that our uniqueness and the unique gifts that we bring to human birth and thought and learning and play and creativity should be nourished and enriched and recognized and rewarded, and that we should be reassured that our uniqueness as a human being and as a mind and as a heart and as a soul is valuable and noble and good and true. In our modern circumstance, as the body of common, sort of the common people, and I'm getting in danger here because I'm going to start talking about norms. As the intelligence of the common, sort of the most common denominator of spectator culture. Okay, I'm calling out a segment. Boy, am I in trouble. The most common denominator, they're not particularly intelligent. And they can be easily swayed by impassioned narratives or arguments to believe things that aren't only wrong, they're impossible. Like they need a major upgrade to get to wrong. And when people begin to police each other's sexual behavior in ways that propose that they know what's normal for other people, we're in really dangerous territory, in my view. Because there's all kinds of things about each human being, and this is the other side of the coin of generalization. It's specificity, right? It's the uniqueness of any actually individual being or moment of that being or situation of that being. And this doesn't get enough airplay. And part of the reason is that our culture is structured, right, well, partly it's structured by inveterate policing, right? We experience this throughout our lives, but from childhood onward, many of us will, at least from the culture, if not from our own parents, family, and peers, we're going to get policed, right? We're going to get rewarded for, we're going to get rewarded for matching the dominant paradigms and frameworks and models, and we're going to get punished for deviation, right? And in fact, the word deviant, it has a negative connotation in English. That doesn't mean that every use, right, generalizations again, that doesn't mean that every use implies negativity, but the general connotation is one of negativity. To call someone a deviant is to denigrate them. Now, there are those of us who have learned that most of our humanity and intelligence lies in the domain of deviation from normative behaviors, because the normative behaviors shave off 87% of what we were born as and could grow up to be if only we had cultures that encouraged rather than punished that, right? And we can develop those cultures between each other regardless of the situation in which we find ourselves, as long as we are A, aware of that possibility, and B, not deceived by the constant fucking normative policing that we're subject to throughout our lives. And it's funny that the sort of normative policing can go so far that the people who the common culture might refer to as deviants could begin policing themselves in the same kind of way that extreme conservatives might otherwise do. Like the cultural left, which of course is also a ridiculous idea, but it's one that's familiar to most of us, the left and the right and the conservatives and the liberals and so on and so forth. It's really interesting that at the extreme side of the left, you get ideas that actually resemble very strongly ideas emergent from extremely conservative right-wing ideologies. That's a good crow feather, all right. Kind of want it. I'm going to resist my So these mushrooms, these fungi, are common now in this moon cycle. Here's one that hasn't really sprouted yet and might have been stepped on. In the center of one that exploded. Yeah, it's weird that you can go so far left that the behavior starts to resemble in various ways the bizarre critical severity and blindness, myopia, right? The Cyclops one-eyed thing that we're relatively used to from extreme right-wing conservatives and such. But one of the things that's happening right now is our cultures are factionating. They're especially in the United States, we're fragmenting. And that process is being intentionally fomented from without and within, right? There's all kinds of predators that can take advantage of that. If you can just fragment the population, they can be had. So, unfortunately, people have this thought that they're defending some incredibly important right or historical ideology or perspective, and they think they're heroically defending some idea, when really a lot of what's going on is just the transmission of various information diseases that are highly contagious and have been intentionally constructed for both contagion and damage and, virulence. Yeah. When we become aware of that, we have the possibility of acquiring a degree of immunity. And I'm using analogies of disease on purpose. Certainly toxic information causes something very similar to disease in human beings. I avoided the news explicitly for many, many years. And only recently, due to change in my employment, I had to become sort of more aware of the news. Which has been a largely miserable process. More miserable is what I see in social media, where I watch the spread of sort of contagious info weapons, right? And the emergence of what I'll refer to, or sort of the resurgence really, and emphasis on normative policing is really frightening, because most of the people who are engaged in that behavior, with some few exceptions, and I don't want to be too hyperbolic here, but I wouldn't trust them with silverware, let alone computers, let alone social media. These people are not insightful enough to tell the difference between a peach and a bomb. And so they somehow feel they have been encouraged by a kind of inflammation, by the intentional inflammation of an aspect of their political ego or their informational ego, to distribute diseases and think this somehow righteous or heroic. It's a fascinating phenomenon that we can learn a great deal from, and we must, if we are to evade the relatively terrifying latter stage consequences of this, and if we are to learn together and teach each other how to recognize the signs of this and avoid it. Now, I have a model of a system that I call the knowledge amp it has the following properties. It's very simple. It would give us a browser that works more like our minds. It would access the internet in a way much more like how our intelligence uses memory instead of the index of a book filled with a bunch of advertisements. It would allow us to kind of dream in data, the browser would. Then it would have an aspect that's a vetting sentinel that would produce a profile of any media item that would help us understand its origins, its verity, like it would give us a verity readout, like how dependable is this information. It would help us understand the pedigree of information, like where do these ideas originate, who prospers when they're spread, who makes money if this media item gets circulated, is this original information, is it a conglomerate of things woven together, is it mostly stolen, is it mostly spin, is the language in the media suspect. It would give us a readout on any kind of media that we could access on the internet, and I call that the verity sentinel. And then there's an analytics engine that would keep all of the analytic data that we produce by interacting with machines private to ourselves and allow us to make profiles so that we can search the internet as ourselves rather than people like us or our psychographic profile. And that would have layers of shareability so that we could form sort of little societies of shared intelligence with people both like and unlike us. And this would help us to understand things that might be particularly dangerous for us or things that might be particularly useful for us. It would keep all the analytics separate, and that would become a valuable commodity over time that we could opt into sharing anonymized data from if we wanted to with corporations instead of just having that data stolen, and we would be paid for that. And again, over time, that thing would become incredibly valuable, and it's a very sophisticated element. We could even produce profiles for people who are no longer alive. We could analyze, for example, the works of Einstein or even Da Vinci and produce profiles so that we could search the web as another human being. And that would protect our privacy, right? This system would be completely distinguished from the internet, and the internet would be accessed through its servers with anonymized data so that we couldn't be tracked and traced. And then there's a social media adventuring aspect where we could have an avatar and we can form teams, not entirely unlike sports teams, that would compete together to solve actual problems in the real world. And ordinary people could have multiple ways of being a personality that competes in teams with others to help solve real-world problems and earns rewards for doing so. So that's the main reason that I posed that little map is that the Verity Sentinel, that particular feature is something we desperately need. And this idea is almost like 15 years old. This isn't new. We're still using browsers and technology that was invented in the 90s. Right? Nobody's even had one better idea. So we're in danger of a situation like our government where we never upgraded the OS, right? We're using something that's catastrophically outdated and thinking ourselves modern, and it's filled with bloatware and malware and viruses and spyware. Our internet has become the opposite of anything we would hope for it to be, by and large, with a few reasonable, exceptions. I think when I think of exceptions, I think of things like Wikipedia, some of the online learning portals that are really popular that'll teach you mathematics, for example, or physics. Their names escape me at the moment, but I've used a couple of them. There's some amazing educational resources that are trustworthy and good. I think Wolfram, the creator of Mathematica, what he's done with the internet is astonishing and brilliant and good. Let's see, what else is really good? I mean, those are some of the examples that come immediately to mind. So we need something to, we need to train, we need to use humans and machines together. We need human-assisted computational heuristics. I'm not going to call it AI because I don't actually believe there's anything like intelligence in devices. I just disagree with that language vehemently. But we need human-assisted computational heuristics, or HATCH. Yeah? And then we can train machines to profile media in a way where we can immediately tell like what the dependability factor is of any given piece of media, its pedigree, its origins, what it relates to, linked ideas, connotations. See, this is the other thing. We are living in a culture that uses language denotatively. But most of our actual intelligence isn't denotative, it's associative, right? Connotations matter. The ideas that surround a central figure are important, and we need to build information systems that reflect this. Because if we don't, our own intelligence is going to collapse down to this denotative derivation. And as we watch that process go on, as I've been observing that over the years, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. People's minds are collapsing into these sort of tokenized, very disabling modes, forms, purposes, functions, and so on. And the forces that benefit from that are just going to keep encouraging it because it's a payday every time it happens, right? And if it's not a payday, it's a war win, right? It doesn't have to pay, it just has to win in combat, yeah? And so if you can get a population to start attacking themselves, and we're seeing astonishing evidence of this in the United States at the moment, you've won a war you didn't have to fight. The citizens fought it for you against each other, right? So all you really need to do is fragment those populations, make sure they stay ignorant, and can't tell the difference between reliable media and contagions, and then you win. And this is part of what has resulted in the normative policing process around, for example, human sexuality. It's not reasonable to tell other people what's normal about their sexuality, how many times to have sex a week or a day or whatever, right? There's nothing, you can make generalizations, but you better call them that. And you should certainly say, not you, but one, should certainly say, there's going to be every kind of divergence from these norms we suggest. But how could it, unless we could observe wild type humans, right? Humans unenculturated, yeah? humans not infected with representational cognition, how would we know what is normal? There's no baseline, right? People can make various suggestions for various reasons, and they'll acquire audiences, and those audiences will agree or disagree or whatever. They'll get contention audience. But this normative policing thing is a real problem in my view, particularly as regards something as personal and uniquely specific to each human being as their sensual nature. I know people across all different kinds of, across the whole spectrum of human sexuality, right? And in fact, I think in general, culturally speaking, the way our cultures view sexuality and the way it's used in our culture, both to sell things and as a commodity, this seems to me very disturbing in general. But what I'm going to say is that our cultures are too timid to understand the actual nature of human sexuality. Far, far too timid. To understand the actual range of what is natural in human beings would obliterate our ideas of normalcy. So for people to be normatively policing others around sex seems important, right? In a way that alerts me that there's a problem. But it goes back to this idea of generalizing, right? It goes back to, I'll tell you what a human is, and the way I'll tell you is by taking an average over some population and then projecting it back to you and telling you what I think the sort of pivot points or the bar graph, should look like. And shouldness is a whole other nightmare topic in human thought, but it's true that generalizations are not without merit. As I said, we can use them as shortcuts to protect us from having to overanalyze or overattend phenomenon, and they're an important aspect of our human cognition, but we need to be aware of their dangers, particularly in informational environments and situations, and the sort of terrifying clusterfuck that we call social media, which is almost, it's really more like a pool of diseases than it's like a society, as far as I'm concerned, at least at the moment. I think we could change that. I think we have to change it. But for right now, it's a messy battleground, particularly now when the stakes are high, right? They're higher than they've ever been, and they're going to keep climbing higher, which means what I'm talking about now, more than likely 5 years from now, people will look back on this and say, oh, well, he was kind of timid. He really didn't call out the problems as severely enough as they needed to be called out. He must have been really holding back. Because over the next 5 years, we're going to see behavior unlike anything we've ever seen in the history of our species. And the battleground for supremacy in online contexts and interactions is going to heat up to a boil right quick here, I think. And we're going to see all kinds of other unexpected behavior from bad actors. We're going to see really complex hacks. We're going to see sophisticated attacks against infrastructure, electricity, food production. We're going to see a lot of new kinds of warfare that our military is absolutely unprepared to meet, primarily because we've been busy building machines. We've been busy building conventional war assets, and the time we live in, it's not that conventional war is an anachronism. You can still have land wars, but what's going to go on now, which is much easier and less complex to foment and pursue, are going to be modes of war that we're familiar with the possibility of, but have only rarely seen direct examples of. So hopefully we've traversed some useful terrain today, and I'm grateful that we had this time, and that we could explore some of the unique and often troubling features of our modern relationships with language, knowledge, computing technologies, and the idea of norms. I think just before I go, I just want to highlight how incredibly unique each of us really is. It's not that we don't fit in a class, you know, you can reasonably call us all human, but every one of us is unique, and different moments of us are different. And in different contexts, we are different. It's almost like we're like an animal that's incomplete, and we are completed by the contexts and relationships we entertain. So I want us to have the opportunity to foment and forge and experience contexts that are diverse and fulfilling and intelligent, encouraging, that allow us to discover the incredible diversity that is the natural sort of foundation of our human nature. And unless we establish those contexts together, we're gonna get the low-hanging sort of the rotten fruit of the culture and the internet and, you know, the thought police. So let's do something else, shall we? Thanks for joining me. The great entrance, Cyprus.